Welcome to EUPrivacyForAll, Session 6 on the GDPR finally published, Article 82 on liability. The Article 77 on the right to compensation and liability discussed during trilogue negotiations was finally renumbered, Article 82. It lays down in paragraph 1 that any person who has suffered material or non-material damage as a result of an infringement of this regulation shall have the right to receive compensation from the controller or processor for the damage suffered. That is to say that any controller involved in processing shall be liable for the damage caused by processing which infringes this regulation. A processor shall be liable for the damage caused by the processing only where it has not complied with the obligations of the GDPR specifically directed to processors or acted outside or contrary to the lawful instructions of the controller. A controller or processor shall be exempted from liability if it proves that it is not in any way responsible for the event giving rise to the damage. Where more than one controller or both a controller and a processor are involved, each controller or processor shall be held liable for the entire damage in order to ensure effective compensation of the data subject. It entails that any controller or processor paying full compensation will be entitled to claim back that part of the compensation corresponding to the responsibility he has not. Court proceedings for exercising the right to receive compensation will be brought before the courts competent under the law of the member state. Recital 146 lays down that the controller or processor should compensate any damage which a person may suffer. The concept of damage will be broadly interpreted in the light of the case law of the Court of Justice. And processing infringing the GDPR also includes processing that infringes delegated and implementing acts. The end of the recital highlights the fact that a controller or processor may institute recourse proceedings. Recital 74 stresses that the responsibility and liability of the controller for any processing of personal data carried out by the controller or on the controller's behalf should be established, and that appropriate and effective measures should be put in place, taking into account the nature, scope, context and purposes and the risks tied to the processing. Recital 79 lays down that a clear attribution of the responsibilities under the GDPR shall be led in the contract, including where a controller determines the purposes and means of the processing jointly with other controllers or where a processing operation is carried out on behalf of this controller. In Recital 81, finally, the processing to be carried out by a processor on behalf of the controller should be framed by the fact that the controller would be using only processors providing sufficient guarantees. The directive led in Recital 55 that any damage which a person may suffer must be compensated for by the controller, who may be exempted if he proves that he is not responsible for the damage, in particular in cases where he establishes fault on the part of the data subject or in case of force majeure. Liability, framed by Article 23 of the directive, stresses the fact that any person is entitled to receive compensation from the controller, and that the controller may be exempted from this liability if he proves that he is not responsible. What should accountable data controllers and processors get prepared for? First, they should interpret broadly the notion of damage. It can be material or non-material damage. Second, they should be ready, whether they are controllers or processors, to being held liable for the entire damage and pay full compensation to data subjects. They also should be ready to claim back against other controllers or processors the part of the compensation given to the data subjects they are responsible for. They should lay down in contractual provisions on exemption and recourse proceedings. Controllers and processors proving that they are not in any way responsible for the even giving rise to the damage can be exempted from liability. A caveat here, processors shall also be liable for the damage only where they did not comply with the GDPR obligation directed specifically to processors or acted outside or contrary to the lawful instructions of the controller. The right to receive compensation shall be brought before the courts competent under member states' laws. And the infringement of the GDPR includes the one of delegated and implementing acts and should be compensated for. So the final question comes to what will be the court's upcoming decisions and clarifications that will be brought on the interpretation of this shared responsibility.